Существует огромное количество лекторов и спикеров, которые просто потрясают уровнем своего профессионализма и знаний, которыми они могут поделиться. Это один класс преподавателей и лекторов. Есть другой класс лекторов, которые настолько умеют заряжать, мотивировать, включать и восхищать какими-то идеями и примерами, что хочется просто встать и делать вот прямо сейчас. Но самым редким является класс людей, спикеров и преподавателей, которые могут совместить и то, и другое, которые параллельно с каким-то невероятным вдохновением способны и могут передать также огромный уровень, огромное количество знаний и поделиться своим колоссальным опытом. Алекс Эли, наш сегодняшний гость, является одним из таких людей. Алекс, помимо того, что он является основателем бюро Architects, которое является частым номинантом и призером различных премий архитектурных за проекты в жилищной сфере и за проекты в сфере создания пространств, общественных пространств для развития местных сообществ. И помимо того, что он является основателем этого бюро, Алекс также является членом Королевского института британских архитекторов и государственным советником по жилищному строительству. Некоторое время он возглавлял отдел устойчивых сообществ комиссии по архитектуре и антропогенной среде. И сейчас он является советником мэра по дизайну и является автором изданного лондонской мэрией руководства по дизайну городских зданий. И в своей лекции Алекс не только расскажет о своих проектах и своем опыте, а также простроит некую траекторию для понимания того, как проекты локальные, средовые, проекты работы с сообществом и выстраивание то, что в Architects называется ДНК добрососедства, простроит траекторию соединения всего этого с глобальными изменениями в мире. Эту лекцию мы назвали «Взгляд запада». Приветствуем Алекса Эли.
I was asked to start my presentation by giving a perspective on urban development from the global West. In my talk, I'm going to be moving from the scale of a city to the scale of a neighborhood, to the scale of a building, and to the dwelling. I'll start with a broader perspective on urban development from the global West. And I want to go back to the 14th century, to this rather beautiful painting by Ambrosio Lorenzetti. It's called The Allegory of Good and Bad Government, and it was painted in 1338. And unlike most of art at the time, the subject matter is civic rather than religious. It depicts an international city, an urban hub filled with bankers, with traders and merchants. In it, the citizens act as a symbolic representation of the various civic offices. There are many shops indicating good commerce and economic conditions. The traffic moves peacefully. Guild members work at their trades. A wedding procession takes place. And maidens can be seen dancing gracefully, perhaps not common today. But at the time, dancers acted as a metaphor for peaceful commonwealth. Lorenzetti expresses the idea that the cause of peace lays not only from the effects of good government, but also from the citizens acting in accordance with the environment. Lorenzetti creates the idea that peace is in part possible due to the citizens and habits of farming, harvesting, fishing, all being in tune with the seasons. So an urban mix of uses, a diverse and inclusive society, a thriving economy, pleasure and a respect for the environment, supported by good governance, seem as relevant today as they did in the 14th century. So what are the priorities today for urban development? I see them as fourfold: physical, environmental, social, and economic. And our focus today needs to consider how these issues remain resilient or sustainable into the future. So first off, physical. Physical, by which we mean the density of population, a measure of the intensity of residential occupancy and the efficient use of land. So resilience would be about being able to sustain residential populations sufficiently high to make adequate use of available infrastructure and to support a diversity of uses. Density of built form is a measure of the intensity of development in relation to available ground level open space. And for this, resilience would be about being able to provide levels of land cover that realize density without inhibiting the quality of public space. And then there's consideration of the adaptability of street layouts and building types so they can respond to changing needs over time. So they can integrate different transport options, create different opportunities for street-based activities, and buildings can accommodate different uses over their lifetime or be converted or retrofitted for different uses. Environmental. We need to consider more sustainable forms of public transport, a measure of environmental benefits associated with that transport, ensuring that it is accessible both near and far. And environmental is also the consideration of green open space, as well as protecting biodiversity and securing that as a long-term public asset. So resilience is about publicly incorporating accessible green space for recreation and the promotion of biodiversity. We then have social, so considering land use diversity, a measure of the multiplicity of interest within urban areas. And we have tenure diversity, a measure of socio-economic mix. In London, we have a huge problem of lack of affordable housing, for example. And resilience or sustainable neighborhoods and cities need to be able to accommodate diverse tenure types, as well as catering for different economic and social groups. And then economic, ensuring that property values are in relation to the wider city and resilient over time and stable over time, not leading to massive inflation, again, a problem that we're facing in London. So for me, these four themes, or these four principles, need to underpin any kind of development and work at all different scales. So the main substance of my talk will look at how we incorporate these themes at scales relating to a new city, to designing of neighborhoods, and then on to dwellings and buildings. How do we design a new city? It's not a question we're often asked, but it's one we were asked by the National Infrastructure Commission in the UK. In specific relation to the Oxford to Cambridge corridor. There's a projected population growth in this region between Oxford and Cambridge of up to 1.9 million people over the next 34 years. This is driven by the growth in education, growth in research, technology, and the various economic opportunities in the area. Historically, we've built new towns like Milton Keynes here, but a population of 2 million is the equivalent of the entire population of Birmingham in England, or Vienna in Austria, or even the entire population of Phoenix, Arizona. And the little outlines of those cities are in scale to the plan above. So there is scope, we believe, to build a new city in the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, and we're proposing it at a place called Calvert. It's at the junction between our new high-speed railway from London to Birmingham and a new train line that connects Oxford to Cambridge. At that sort of interface, at that sort of junction, we believe it can support and sustain a new town or a new city to accommodate at least a large proportion of those 2 million. We're thinking around 250,000. The balance would be accommodated at urban growth of the existing cities or other settlements in the area. So our thinking is to develop a smart, compact new settlement. And we propose the idea of a smart city, which we've called Arcadia. Arcadia is a morphing of 2 words, urban, characteristic of city life, and Arcadia, idea of life in the countryside that is believed to be perfect. But then also it plays on the idea of meaning the origin or the earliest. So it's a hypothetical city, but one that we believe is much needed. But looking at the examples of the past, we've built cities such as Letchworth Garden City, which had the concept by Ebenezer Howard, or Milton Keynes by Derek Walker and his colleagues. Our proposal for a new city starts with the concept of a campus, a bit like the one we're in, but supported by a much more diverse range of uses. Everything you need from your daily life within 10 minutes walk. But this campus is made up of a series of clusters that you see in this illustration. So how do we develop this campus? We start with a development cluster that is designed as a walkable neighborhood. Everything you need for your daily life within 10 minutes walk. Adjacent clusters are within a 10 to 20-minute cycle ride or tram ride or public transport network. So you see the connections through to the neighboring clusters. But streets are prioritized for people over the car. They promote alternative, more sustainable forms of transport. And here you see the connection between landscape, between the clusters, and the transport that runs through them. A cluster can accommodate a range of densities, a mix of uses, a diverse mixed age group, mixed income. It's people-focused and inclusive. It thinks about the characteristics of a neighborhood and what you would want within close walking distance of your home or your workplace. So we start with a single cluster, which would accommodate between 12,000 and 50,000 people. And a series of clusters can be strung together like a necklace, with as many clusters as suits the setting, the infrastructure, and the demand. Their locations are arranged to preserve and enhance green space and open landscape. And the green space is intended to be productive and conceived as part of the commons economy, managed for the production of prosperity, well-being, and self-sufficiency. Each cluster has a dedicated space for wider city usage beyond just housing in order to create a place. We imagine that individual clusters could have greater focus or specialism. So some might prioritize culture, some might be more focused on education, others might be a bit about economy and business. Really just in the same way that our cities have areas of particular uses. In many ways, this concept is how cities like London have developed. It grew as a series of villages, as this beautiful map suggests. The West End is a destination for entertainment, the city for trade and commerce and finance. But London villages have coalesced over time and morphed and merged into one large metropolis. With our concept of a city, that landscape would be preserved and continue to run between those specialist clusters. The city needs to follow sustainable principles, and for these we adopt those ones advocated by One Planet Living. Currently, humankind is utilizing the resources of 3 planets, and we need to limit that to 1. So the principles that we advocate in our new city include everything from health and well-being, sustainable natural habitats, carbon neutral development, as well as minimal waste and sustainable water use. Rather like the climate change conference and the deal that's just been struck in Poland, our thinking is that the principles of those One Planet Living principles would be adopted through a citizen's charter, and it becomes a form of governance for the new place. So if we look at specific examples, sustainable energy will be driven from wind and solar to produce combined heat and power. Water is recycled through the use of grey water for irrigation or for non-potable use. And landscape is used for local food production, but then closely linked in with good management of water and other key open space considerations. So hypothetical cities are not often something that you have the chance to design, and we're not sure whether our proposal for Arcadia will gain traction in the UK, but we know that it's much needed, and we know that it's an ambition that can be realised and has been realised in the past. Milton Keynes was a new town, Bath and Edinburgh as well. But perhaps more relevant today are the sort of urban extensions, the neighbourhoods that we build within our cities. And so I'll move on to look at the neighbourhood scale. The cluster that I've just described, which is perhaps an idealised version of a walkable neighbourhood with its mix of uses, everything within 10, 20-minute walking distance, could be looked at like this at a closer scale. It's a concept diagram of the desirable characteristics of a walkable lifetime neighbourhood, one that sustains and endures over people's lifetimes and subsequent generations. So it'll have a choice of housing with a mix of tenures and age profiles. It has high streets with shops and services. It has cultural facilities in the form of libraries. It has business spaces, co-working, incubator businesses for new types of enterprise. And then it has health and hospitals, recreation spaces, as well as education spaces. But it's not idealised, this. If we look at a part of London like Westminster, this is just one neighbourhood in Westminster, you see that it is connected. It has good public transport links in the form of underground, bus links. It has a library, it has education facilities, it has theatre and galleries that provide cultural enrichment, as well as retail and local parks. It has a diverse mix of uses seen in this figure ground plan. Predominantly residential, as most of our cities are, and I'll come on to housing, which pretty much forms the backdrop of most of our cities. But you can see also combined with accessible local retail, commerce, religious facilities, hotels, and so on. And really, these are the kind of places we enjoy, places where people want to live. And it's an idea that we try to promote in seeking to redress the balance from endless urban sprawl and suburban expansion of our cities. We know that people want and enjoy access to retail, to markets, to good food, which can also be in the form of indoor markets, delivering sustainable food to the door. Successful cities and neighbourhoods have a rich mix and diversity of public space. This is a remarkable granary square in King's Cross, one of the largest regeneration projects in the UK recently and still going on. It's where Google, Facebook have all moved to, right in the centre of London. And the first thing the developer did before building any kind of offices, any kind of housing, was to introduce a new public space. And you can see that the locals from the area have creatively used this for their own purpose. And a sustainable neighbourhood will have quality of public streets and a network of spaces where you can enjoy walking around or walking through and avoiding the traffic, the pollution that comes with driving through our cities. And the neighbourhood of the future needs to accommodate more diverse forms of working. The growth of things like co-working, a company called WeWorks is very prolific in London, that offers space for new businesses, start-up businesses, and places for exchange of knowledge and ideas. And then the diverse neighbourhood will have a mix of housing, catering for all forms of society, from individuals, young professionals, to families, but also something that's facing the UK considerably at the moment is how we cater for our ageing population and the needs of those who get progressively older and less able. So one of our ideas at May is to promote and develop what we call a new London hybrid block. In the UK, developers are typically split between house builders or commercial developers who build offices. But increasingly, there's a new type of developer emerging who's interested in creating a mixed development that can accommodate the range of uses I've just described. And I'll talk through a bit more our concept for a new London hybrid block. The hybrid block accommodates ideas about the future nature of retail and workplace, as well as the future of London living. It's promoting 12 ideas that I'll just go through in turn. So the first one is about shifting our thinking from isolated retail. In the UK, we have a lot of large-scale, out-of-town retail parks that you have to drive to, and it's looking at reintegrating retail into the local neighbourhood through a mixture of large footprint supermarkets, but also local bespoke and boutique development. The nature of retail is changing from superstores to local delivery and just-in-time delivery. So instead of large retail stores, in urban neighbourhoods, we can accommodate what's called dark stores, which become distribution centres for our online trading and our purchasing online. But that in turn can be supported by local showrooms that actively are accommodated in our high streets. Such large footprint buildings need to be long life and loose fit. They need to be capable of adapting over time. So something that might be built as a dark store could adapt to become a car park, could become multi-use spaces for leisure, such as cinemas, and in turn they can accommodate gardens above. And then the nature of workspace itself is changing, from deep plan workspaces to shallow plans that give access to good daylight, natural ventilation, and flexibility as our working patterns change over time. And the hybrid block would promote active transport, so shifting away from car use to promoting a modal shift through low emissions public and active transport, whether it's cycling, buses, or walking. And the hybrid block would accommodate an inclusive and diverse mix of public spaces. Now, what about the future of residential? Again, in the past, we've built too many ghettos, isolated from places of work, from places of shopping and retail. And those ghettos are often monotenure. They're designed for either the poorest in society or the richest become very exclusive. But the hybrid block would accommodate a diverse mix of residential types, catering for different socio-economic groups. That diversity might include renting, it might include market ownership, but it could also include custom build. Again, a type of development, maybe you saw it on your European travels, which is becoming more a topic of conversation in the UK. Our developers are a very small minority building the majority of housing, and yet we're very keen to diversify the type of agents who deliver housing, and custom build may be one of the mechanisms, as well as cooperatives. And then diverse housing is also about catering for families, young professionals, elderly, as well as having hotels for visitors. And as I've mentioned, catering for the elderly through intergenerational homes that are future-proofed to cater for our lifetime needs. And then the other consideration of urban development today is improving forms of construction, whether that's about improving health and safety on site, reducing the time it takes to build, and modern methods of construction and lean construction and more environmentally friendly forms of construction are becoming the norm, helping to achieve viability, but also delivering quality. And all that comes together to help form housing that improves healthy living. So instead of deep plan blocks where you get single aspect apartments with only south-facing or north-facing aspect, poor ventilation and lack of cross-ventilation, the hybrid block would accommodate shallow dwellings, shallow plan dwellings, where you get sun and ventilation on both sides. And the hybrid block would incorporate resilience, responding to high energy performance, which I'll come on to in due course, be digitally connected, and it would be delivered through building information modeling systems and facilities management. So I'd like to turn to you for 5 minutes and ask you to think, either from your travels, and this is a question not just for Moscow, but from the cities you've come from. Perhaps you could work in pairs just for a couple of minutes to discuss with you or between you models of successful urban blocks or neighborhoods that you're aware of. What are the land use mixes that they accommodate? How are they arranged? And what are the qualities of that development? So perhaps you could just turn to your neighbor for a couple of minutes and think of somewhere that you've been on the tours as part of this program, or that you're familiar with from your hometown. And perhaps a couple of you would be prepared to feedback and offer some thoughts. Okay, let's get some feedback from the floor then. Ileana's got a microphone, so anyone want to go first? Can I have a show of hands? And we'll just take a sample from the room. There's someone down here. I suppose I'm interested, perhaps you could introduce yourself. Tell me about the particular neighborhood or city block that you've described. Is it a model that you're exploring here? Is it relevant? What is the sort of mix of uses of a successful neighborhood in your eyes? And what are the qualities of the example? We've got one here, Ileana. Okay.
Да, я не собиралась привести пример, так как в диалоге я честно призналась, что я не знаю ни одного примера, который я бы считала действительно успешным. Поднятая рука — это был призыв к тишине.
Okay.
Здравствуйте, меня зовут Евгения, город Иркутск. Иркутск — это 50 километров от Байкала. У нас есть пример реализованный успешно, это 130-й квартал. Это квартал в центре города, он был частной застройки, и 7 лет назад его перезагрузили, и теперь это квартал туристический и временного пребывания. То есть там гостиницы, магазины, музеи. Есть офисы, например, компании «Российские железные дороги». И на сегодняшний момент этот квартал, объекты стоят на частной земле, все общественное пространство, там интересный бульвар, площадь, проходя, такой, он имеет структуру протяженности, да, общественное пространство принадлежит муниципалитету, а здания, они в частной собственности. И пример этого квартала стал первой точкой, и сейчас у нас реализуется второй этап, это уже название проекта «Иркутские кварталы», где уже будет еще внедрено жилье. То есть мы увидели опыт 130-го квартала, поняли, что людей, проживающих, должно быть больше и меньше туристов. Меньше туристов в плане протекания через эту территорию. И поэтому следующий этап уже будет больше на жилье ориентирован.
Can I ask, before you hand back the mic, so was this a neighbourhood or development that was initiated by the city or by private development? Who started the process? Was there a master plan?
Изначально был сделан мастер-план иркутскими архитекторами, было 3 автора, и он был по концепции усадебной застройки. То есть восстановить усадебную застройку, но в новом формате, то есть подвести инженерные сети, сделать парковки, и уклон был на жилье. Но потом уже совместно с правительством области, конкретно с губернатором, который пришел к нам в область, перезагрузили смыслы и сделали его более туристическим, более коммерческим. Частично убрали вот эту часть особняков, заборов, и теперь это проницаемая структура с большим торговым центром как точкой притяжения на 40 тысяч квадратных метров. И мелкая сетка ритейла, музеев, гостиниц.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else have any other examples? One over here.
Добрый день, я из Москвы. В Москве таких проектов появляется
Поближе
все
микрофон,
больше.
пожалуйста, держите.
Слышно так?
Да.
Проект, который нравится лично мне, это проект реновации бывшей ткацкой фабрики на Дербеневской набережной. Насколько я знаю, это проект, сделанный по инициативе частных инвесторов, и сейчас там появилась жилая недвижимость, коммерческие площади, рестораны и музей русского реалистичного искусства в районе Павелецкой.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a really interesting example, and I think something that certainly in London we're looking at, and a lot of successful examples across Europe where historical infrastructure or buildings become the kind of starting point for a new thriving mixed development. They have character, they have richness, they have kind of interesting architecture that can adapt and change, and often that's what gives a new neighbourhood its identity. In London, the example I showed you in King's Cross had the old granary buildings, which are now the Central St Martin's School of Art, and they become the sort of go-to place for the neighbourhood as it springs up with new buildings around it. Anyone else, before I carry on, I'll carry on my talk, but maybe one more example, one over here.
Я сейчас приведу пример. Мне кажется, Бондарева Дарья, Самара. Мне кажется, многие россияне согласятся. Мой пример — это Кошелев проект в Самаре. То есть изначально это начиналось как моножилая среда эконом-класса. Это одинаковые домики на протяжении, мне кажется, 120 гектар. Одинаковые планировки, одинаковые домики, даже по цвету ничем не отличаются. Но в чем феномен? В том, что этот проект сочетает в себе жителей разных социальных категорий. То есть это начиная от пенсионеров, заканчивая мигрантами. Большая часть — это молодые семьи с детьми. И как эволюционирует этот район, что мы видим на сегодняшний день? В том, что арендная ставка на ритейл там выше, чем в центре города. В том, что Офисы крупных компаний, таких как Lab Group, Мегафон, размещают там свои, строят новые здания, потому что они видят, что есть дешевая рабочая сила, при этом не низкоквалифицированная зачастую. И появляются рабочие места, появляется ритейл, появляется какой-то там комьюнити. То есть это процесс от обратного. Застройщик создал варварскую моножилую среду, но она эволюционировала в смешанную.
Okay, thank you. I think the contrast of those examples shows how difficult successful kind of urban regeneration or creating vibrant mixed-use neighborhoods is. And it's something, frankly, that we're struggling with in London. And as I think I've made clear, that typically the neighborhoods we build are either exclusively housing in the suburbs or kind of commercial offices in the city centres. But I'm convinced that more sustainable forms of development are the ones that create that diversity and that mix. Having said that, I'm going to move on to housing, and specifically housing, because most of our work is in this field. Fortunately, mostly in central London, so by its very nature, it has good access to transport, to retail, and to employment and opportunity. As well as practicing architecture and urban design, I also work a lot with central government and city governments. And currently we're working with the Mayor of London, drafting new planning guidance in the form of what's called supplementary planning guidance. It's a standard recognized form of planning document. And the housing design planning guidance sets out the standards that the mayor expects in terms of building quality. One of the huge pressures in London is, as I've alluded to, is population growth, pressures on lack of affordable housing and the need to build more housing. But that housing is prioritized to grow within the city boundaries. We have what's called the green belt around London. London is hemmed in by protected open land. So there's a limit to how far out it can expand. And so that means we need to very cleverly reuse redundant sites, whether it's the historical infrastructural buildings and warehouses that can be repurposed, or industrial buildings and complexes that can be repurposed, or whether it's about intensifying neighborhoods that are currently low rise and inefficient. So the housing design planning guidance is promoting ideas about how to build more intensively, how to develop forms of housing that are more suitable to urban living and that can meet our needs of today. And it sets out the qualities that we want to see from private developers as well as social landlords or local authorities or municipal authorities who might be building housing. So one thing it looks very closely at is the relationship between intensification, the need to build more, use land more efficiently, and building type or typology, i.e. the mix of types of buildings. Someone mentioned mansion blocks earlier, which are very common in London as well. So looking at the types, and then quality of life factors, and I'll come on to what those are. But good housing for us is a mixture of housing that's designed to promote quality of life and well-being, that is clear in its urban type, and that delivers intensification. So types, what do we mean by that? We mean at the very smallest scale, small clusters of houses. Instead of individual houses on their plot of land, clusters can start forming tight-knit groups where some of the spaces, such as entrance courtyards or even gardens, are shared, perhaps even models that support co-living or cooperatives. Again, a growing movement in the UK. We then have the almost archetypal model of housing in London, the Terrace House. For anyone who knows London, you'll be familiar with vast tracts of land that are populated by the Georgian Terrace House, which was often seen at the time as the model and epitome of good living. Unlike our mainland European counterparts who like to live in apartments and live on one level, the British seem to be obsessed by living vertically, i.e. bedrooms above living rooms above, and so on. So the terrace house is a very English model of housing, but it's very efficient because houses are tightly packed next to each other. They have small front gardens onto the street, efficient small gardens to the back, but good for city living. But more typically today, even the terrace is coming under pressure because we need to deliver more housing than we can necessarily support within a terrace of homes. So we're now looking at linear urban blocks, or perhaps more commonly referred to as mansion blocks. So these might be gallery access apartments or apartments with pairs of flats around a core. But they typically form strong street edges, either back of pavement or behind a small threshold into the building. They have shared lobbies for the multiple occupants who then have private entrances into their dwellings off a corridor or off a gallery, an external gallery. But they're a very urban form of development. They're very suitable to the kind of density and intensity that we need to be building today. But then there are also other nuances or more bespoke building types or residential block types like the urban villa block, perhaps more singular in its character. It sits like a pavilion in a landscape. And then we have the courtyard forming block, where perhaps four sides of development look onto a shared garden for use solely by the residents of that development. And I showed in my hybrid block earlier, that was a form of courtyard block, where perhaps the dwellings that immediately face onto that courtyard block have their own small private garden space, you can just see there, but then everyone above them and the apartments can get access to attractive and usable outdoor space. And then, of course, we've got tower blocks. There's huge pressure on London to deliver high buildings, and there's a lot of scrutiny at the moment about the suitability of the type for housing, especially family housing. We tend to prioritize family housing lower to the ground, closer to the street. It's what Jane Jacobs, in her book, The Life and Death of the Great American City, promoted, the idea that vibrant communities come through the interaction on the street. So I think there are a lot of questions being asked about the suitability of tower blocks for residential accommodation. But nonetheless, we've got to face the reality that they are going to be a big part of housing delivery. So I'm just going to illustrate how some of these types have been used in a few of our schemes in London. This is Agar Grove. It's a neighbourhood in London Borough of Camden in North London. You can see that it's bounded on two sides by railway. And to the north of it is a very lovely conservation area with Victorian houses and villas. But it was built, Agar Grove was built in the 1950s, early 60s, and it hasn't stood the test of time. It's in poor quality, it's falling apart, the accommodation is substandard, there's problems of overcrowding. Although it looks very green from this aerial photo, those green spaces are poorly accessed and underused. The Agar Grove estate is on the left, and you can see that it turns its back on the street, unlike its Victorian counterparts on the other side of the street, which create a strong street edge and a more legible and create more active street frontage, the sort of thing that Jane Jacobs promotes. And another photo showing how the ground floor is denied any access to those open green spaces. And the tower block in the middle of the estate, which again sits in a car park, so not a welcoming place to arrive home or to leave. So central to our thesis on this project was to rehouse all the existing residents of these buildings, to rehouse them on the new development, not to move them out the area, but to do the development, the redevelopment in a phased way where we could provide new houses for them prior to demolishing the existing buildings. So a key component of that is consultation, and it was something I was asked to speak specifically about. There's a lot of mistrust and fear. People have lived in these homes, whether they've got damp, whether they've got problems of poor heating, falling apart. Nonetheless, they are their homes, and there's a lot of fear that goes on when cities talk about redevelopment. So you have to talk very closely and carefully with residents, and we do that through consultation. These sort of engagement exercises where we develop models, we bring in the residents, we talk about the change, we show them what's happening, and we listen. And it's really important we have several events over time, over the course of a project, where we demonstrate how we've listened and how we've then fed back any concerns or any priorities that residents have into the evolving design. So we'll have exhibitions where we show that the residents said that they don't like floor-to-ceiling windows, or they want more security, or they want access to open gardens. And then we demonstrate how, in our designs and our layouts, we've responded. Because in that way, you get the residents on your side and supportive of what you're doing, which in turn leads to the local politicians supporting it through the planning system and approving it. But then it's not just about those who are articulate and the parents who have a view. You also need to listen to the future generations who are going to live here. So we run exercises and events for the children of the neighbourhood, inviting them to create their dream outside space or such activities. It's a way of engaging, a way of bringing people along with the process and getting them to realise the extent of change. But then increasingly today, we're also looking at online platforms for sharing our ideas. And we use one called Sticky World, where we post online exhibition boards and descriptions of the development, and local constituents, the community, the residents, can post-it note their comments. So for example, in here, we're inviting comments on what people like or don't like about their existing neighbourhood, what they would like to see improved. And it's a great way of gathering evidence and feedback beyond the one-off exhibitions that maybe happen just once a month. So it becomes a resource for us as designers. It becomes a way that we enrich our projects and demonstrate that we're responding to the needs of those that we're designing for. Because without their support, or rather with their support, there's much greater chance that the projects that we develop and design are going to be popular in their use. So at Agar Grove, we introduced a new neighbourhood where the tower block in the centre of a plan here was refurbished. There were new buildings around that introduced all the ideas I've promoted so far. Streets, active streets, new public spaces, open green spaces, a rich mix and a diversity of housing types. And you see in the aerial photo that we have large-scale villa blocks that respond in kind and in scale to the Victorian buildings opposite. We have terrace housing on the right, and then we have the linear urban block or the mansion block at the back, as well as a new tower block So again, accommodating a diversity of house types, which in turn caters for a diversity of need. And here you see some of that mix in pictures. You see from the sort of 5, 6, 7-story linear urban blocks to the 22-story tower to some of the lower rise buildings more reflective of the conservation concerns, because it's not just about meeting the needs of the existing residents that we're rehousing, but you have to appease and get on side the residents of the surrounding neighbourhood, who are often very principled and have a lot to say about development across the road or in their back garden. We have what's called NIMBYs, not in my backyard, who is a sort of expression for people or groups of people who typically oppose development. But there are ways through consultation, through good design, to try and meet their concerns. So just some statistics. The development previously had 249 homes. We're doubling the number of homes on the site, so delivering 493 new homes. That will rehouse all those existing residents, as well as provide an uplift and new accommodation for an incoming population. And that's being entirely funded by private sale. So the homes that are sold on the open market will pay for the replacement affordable homes, which are socially rented. So they're subsidized rent by the city for the poor or for those who have low income. One of the factors that we considered very early on was how we design the homes to be low in their energy use. A lot of tenants and residents of this particular borough suffer from what's called fuel poverty, i.e. they can't afford to heat their homes adequately. So the client, the local borough, insisted that we design very high environmentally performing homes. And they're designed to Passive House standard. So that's about ensuring good orientation, so they benefit from solar gain, that they're efficient in their form factor, that they're highly insulated. They shade from the sun in the summer, but they benefit from solar gain in the winter. They're airtight, so they reduce heat loss. And they have things like MVHR, so mechanical ventilation and heat recovery. So no heat is lost. So extracts from kitchen hobs for cookers or from bathrooms is cleaned and refiltered back into the home. And even with that sort of technology, we can still build in the sort of materials that Londoners like, of brick and tiling and paving. And that gives an example of the mix of materials that we're trying to promote in this project. And some examples of a few. So the scheme is under development. It'll be being built out over the next 5 to 6 years. And we hope it'll look like this when it's finished. But you get a sense from these views of the diversity that we're trying to achieve, both in terms of the built form, but also the public spaces. So for the last 10 minutes I think I've got, I just want to move on to the dwelling scale and talk about the home. I mentioned earlier that the guidance that we're developing for the Mayor of London promotes a number of principles that should be considered when designing a home. So the home needs to be future-proofed, it needs to be cater for a diversity, as I've talked about, it needs to consider the relationship from the street to the front door, it needs to promote good space standards and be sustainable. So I won't go through all these in turn, but if we take an example of the theme of home as a place of retreat, that's about considering privacy, as well as aspect and outlook, as well as daylight into the home. If we take something like mixed places, if we're trying to promote the diversity that I talked about earlier, then we need to consider air quality and mitigating noise pollution. If we're talking about living sustainably, then we need to promote ideas about good environmental design and energy efficiency. So all these principles are going to be promoted and set out in the guidance, which will be published early next year. So just a couple of examples to finish off how we've been delivering this on schemes of ours recently. This is, again, a neighbourhood in London where we've developed some infill development on these grey, the plots in grey are infill housing, which are on previously unoccupied sites, car parks, or underused open space. And you see through the slightly more detailed models, we've got a small linear urban block, we've got a terrace of houses, pavilion or villa. And again, it was done for the local community, so engagement through use of models was really important. They become really useful tools for evidence and explaining the design thinking. So the first building is a small terrace of houses, which backs onto an improved landscape garden, which is accessible for all the residents. So those houses have their kitchen, living and dining space on the ground floor and bedrooms above. And then that's bookended by an apartment block, which the space between them forms a gateway into the communal garden. And then an upper level plan showing the relationship of bedrooms to a small outdoor private space for those terrace houses. Or in this case, the apartments create an enfilade of rooms between a kitchen dining space, a living space, and then a terrace space, which we believe kind of creates a really delightful experience and sequence of habitable spaces. An example of the sort of tools and techniques that we use when designing. So here are models. And as built, one of the buildings. So you can see that it backs onto an old building built in the 80s, and it's sandwiched or up against and next to a much larger block behind. But the important thing that we're trying to promote is good interior space that has good ventilation, good daylight and sunlight, as well as outdoor space that can be used for amenity, which you see here on the roof of the terrace. It has its own patio garden or terrace, roof terrace or balcony, as well as access to a garden behind. And here you see what I just described, the enfilade of spaces. So the rooms are connected by glazed screens, so you can close off the kitchen and dining space if you're cooking or want to close off the noise from the living room, but equally you can see through to your family in the neighbouring room. And then balconies are generous enough to put furniture, tables and chairs outside, or plants, as well as drying space for laundry. And then the other building, a linear urban block, responds to the historical buildings on the other side of the street with these long, generous balconies. Ground floor has a small community space which can be used for events, and it'll be run by the community. And then upstairs are these series of maisonettes. So instead of flats, you go in at one level, off a gallery at the top, and you come into a story with your kitchen, living and dining space, and then you go upstairs to your bedrooms. So it's kind of taking the idea of a terrace house, but making it into an apartment block. And here you see that the first floor sits above the community space, but that allows us to create slightly more generous floor-to-ceiling heights in the first floor. So we have this stepped level to improve what's typically a 2.5 meter floor-to-ceiling becomes a 3 meter floor-to-ceiling over part of the living space. And then out the front is a generous balcony that runs the full frontage of the apartment, which you see here. And that in turn provides shading at the height of summer to avoid overheating of the apartment. And here on the right, you see the double aspect of the corner unit. And then another example of a linear urban block, where here we've created what's called split level living. So you have a half level you come in at a half level with kitchen dining space, and then you go down half a level to your living space, or up half a level to your bedroom space. So you get these interesting spatial qualities within the development or within the individual home. And it's very much inspired by an example here, the Narkomfin building by Ginsberg, which we hugely admire and understand is now under refurbishment. And then the last project, again, perhaps it brings together a few of these strands of thought, is called Brentford Lock, and it's out in West London. And it combines a linear block on the waterfront with a courtyard-forming block behind. It has apartments as well as townhouses and terraces. So it creates a variety within the one development. So here you see the apartments are within these pavilions. So by making it a pavilion, again, it promotes dual aspect for all the apartments. And then each pavilion is then linked by either a series of townhouses or a bridge, which in turn has accommodation in it. And so here you see on the right our scheme just completed, where you get the two pavilion buildings and then the bridge, which forms a large and generous atrium to the accommodation above. And then there are very interesting architects who have been working on the neighbouring developments as well. So it's creating a large new place. And the ground floor of the block facing the river has this generous atrium, so good sort of entrance experience for all the residents, which looks out from the street, creates a small public square as a gathering place, then connects through to the atrium, and then looks out to the river at the top of this plan. So that can be used by the community for events or festivals, or even just their tenant meetings when they have them. And then the apartments are 4 flats clustered around the lift and stair core. And so here you see that the bridge forms this double height atrium, which you see here. And very simple materials. It's thermally outdoors, so it's not expensive. It's moderated climate because it's glazed in, but it doesn't need to waste heat and energy. And then the apartments themselves have these large, generous balconies, again, that run the full width of the apartment and provide an extra room, or almost an outdoor room, which you see, again, an upper level plan where you can see that the balconies to the riverside run the full width. And the apartments have dual aspect. And balconies large enough to sit out and enjoy in our clement weather when we get it. And then the top floor, the expression of the Sawtooth Roof that you saw, the zigzag roof, is very much inspired by the local place. It was a former industrial site. It had wharf buildings and warehouses, which were often characterized by sawtooth roofs. And so for this project, we've been able to utilize that for the benefit of creating good skylights into the apartment. So in all our housing, we try and deliver this range of qualities in order to kind of make a place enjoyable to live and welcoming and future-proof for our changing needs over time. And it's something that we consider both at the city scale, the neighbourhood scale, the building scale, and we hope the dwelling scale. Thank you.